Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our policy webinar series. I'm Lauren Lipovic, head of Esri Public Policy, and I'm joined today by my colleague Bonnie Stair, solution engineer and team lead for emerging business. In today's policy webinar, Bonnie and I will provide an overview of Esri's exploratory analysis tool, Insights, for public policy professionals. During today's webinar, Bonnie will discuss the product capabilities at a high level, provide licensing information, and provide two demonstrations highlighting functionality. While the two demonstrations are focused on specific workflows, identifying potential healthcare fraud, and identifying patterns in international affairs, the tool and workflows can be applied to a myriad of policy problems at any level, state, local, or federal. I'm now going to turn it over to Bonnie for today's Insights presentation.
All right, thank you, Lauren. So we'll go ahead and get started. This is the outline of what I'm going to follow today. So we'll start with an overview of the Insights product and talk a little bit about some use cases and workflows. Then we'll take a deeper dive into the functionality of doing analysis and sharing with Insights and look at different map and chart types that you can use. And then we'll wrap up at the end with how to get access to Insights. So to begin with an overview, Insights is a web-based product that allows you to do exploratory analysis with your data. So those of you who are familiar with the rest of Esri's platform, you know that there are many different places where you can do analysis. What's unique about Insights is you don't necessarily need to know what questions you're trying to answer ahead of time. The product is really designed to give you freedom to explore your data in a variety of different ways, to look at trends and come up with different insights. It's meant to be visual and intuitive, so it doesn't require a lot of training to be able to get up and running with it. You can combine analysis and visualization on what we call cards, and we'll see many more examples of those. These cards are linked and responsive, so they interact with each other. And this can help you drive impactful decisions. So you're using your data to learn, record tradecraft, share, and collaborate with other users. And this can help you quickly increase your decision confidence. So in putting Insights to work, there's a variety of different industries where we see use cases for this type of exploratory analysis. Everything from banking, doing investment analysis, law enforcement looking at crime patterns, local government looking at budget and human resource allocation, to health and human services analyzing access to care. And so when we talk about policy, policy can really touch on any type of different industry. So there's really no limit to the types of data that you might want to investigate as a policy analyst. This might be grants and spending, so where is money going? Looking at transportation and infrastructure, like the use of infrastructure and its status. Similarly, looking at real property or land management, what types of land uses are there and the status of properties. As we mentioned, healthcare and access to healthcare and health data itself, where is disease occurring? Housing, maybe looking at housing programs and how they're performing. Poverty and other types of income and demographic statistics. And the list could really go on and on. We could look at natural disasters, looking at forest fires, for example, all different types of industries that have data that you might want to do this type of exploratory analysis on. And with Esri's ArcGIS platform, we talk about 9 common patterns of use: mapping and visualization, data management, field mobility, monitoring, analytics, design and planning, decision support, constituent engagement, and sharing and collaboration. And Insights really touches on 5 out of the 9 of these patterns. Certainly analytics, as we'll see examples of. Mapping and visualization, definitely, where we're creating these cards with maps and charts and tables. Decision support, so as we mentioned, hopefully this exploratory analysis is giving you deeper insight in your data and helping you come to better data-driven decisions. Constituent engagement, so using these visualizations to communicate out with constituents. And then sharing and collaboration, being able to capture tradecraft from your analysis and share it back to other users in your organization. So as we mentioned, Insights is a web-based application that leverages data that could be spatial or non-spatial or tabular data. So we treat all data equally within this system. We don't give preferential treatment to one type or the other. And then we leverage that data to do visualization and analysis. Now, this data can come from a variety of sources. We can leverage data that may come from a relational database like SQL Server or Oracle, geodatabases. So if you've already made your databases spatially aware, we can connect to those as well. Big data stores such as SAP HANA are also able to be connected into your insights. We can also leverage local data. You may just have a spreadsheet on your machine that you want to work with. So CSVs and Excel workbooks, and I'll show a couple examples of leveraging those. And then of course we can connect to spatial layers that are already available to you through your organization. Maybe it's data that you've uploaded into the ArcGIS system and created a feature service from. We can connect to those and leverage those for analysis as well. And then once we connect to all of these different data sources, you can really follow your workflow as an analyst or a data scientist. So that's everything from data preparation to geo-enablement, visualization, analysis, and sharing. So to look at those in a little bit more depth, here's just some examples of these types of workflow steps that you can complete with Insights. So in data preparation, we can format fields and calculate new fields. We can geo-enable our data by geocoding it or joining it to boundaries. Obviously, we can create visualizations with maps and charts and graphs. Perform analysis, either statistical analysis, which we've got some new options coming in the next release around link analysis and regression, as well as spatial analysis. So asking questions like how are things distributed, what's nearby, how has it changed? Recording and repeating your analysis, being able to document those steps that you've taken in your analysis, document best practices, and sharing those models out to other analysts. And then sharing your results, the visualization and the answers that you've come to with your analysis, being able to share that with other users, either internally or externally. And so as we talk about, this is being able to empower both analysts and data scientists. So this might be starting to sound a lot like a business intelligence tool. So our approach with Insights is to take a geospatial approach. So no other BI tool out there allows looking at location in this depth. We go beyond just simply looking at points on the map, and we treat spatial as a fundamental component of that analysis. And you're also able to leverage context and add in more spatial layers from the world's largest digital atlas, coming from Esri and our larger user community. So let's take a look at a quick demo just to introduce you to what the product looks like. So I'm logged into Insights, and the first thing I can do is create a new workbook. And when I create a new workbook, the first thing that it's going to ask me for is to add in some data. So you can see the different types of connections to data that I can make. In this case, I have a spreadsheet of hospitals across the country that perform major joint replacement. So this was data that we got from CMS. So we have the address and we've already converted that into a coordinate. And we also have information on how much they charge for this procedure. And therefore we can calculate the percentage that they cover. So the percent of this procedure that's covered by Medicare. So I'm going to upload this spreadsheet into Insights. So I'll choose the Excel or CSV option. And then from Windows Explorer, I can just drag and drop that Excel file. I've got one table in there, so I'll go ahead and add that. And as we bring it in, you see nothing happens right away. Again, we're not making any assumptions about this being spatial data. If I want to work with it as tabular data, I can do so. But in this case, I do want to start mapping some of this information. So the first thing that I need to do is enable location on my data. And as I mentioned, since I've already got the coordinates calculated, this should be a fairly easy process. It's found those columns for me automatically. So I'll go ahead and run that geo-enablement process. So now you can see I have a location attribute here. So I'm able to start mapping with this. So the first thing that I might want to map is the average covered charges. So let me go ahead and select this variable. If I drag it over onto my main screen here, I'm prompted to either map it, create a chart, or create a table. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and drag it onto a map. So this is how much the hospital charges on average for this procedure. You can see it's sized my dots representing each hospital by that amount. So I can take another variable and do the same thing. So maybe I want to compare this to the percent that's covered by Medicare. So I have that percent variable down here. Similarly, I can take that, drag that on a map right next to my first one. And you can see how the dots look different between each of these maps. I can also change the style. Maybe I don't want these black dots. Maybe I want them to be a different color, something like this. And then maybe I also want to change my base map. So I want kind of a neutral background for my maps. So I'll choose those. So now we can compare the average coverage charge to the percent that's charged or covered by Medicare. Maybe I want to add some more context to my map. So in addition to adding in data from an Excel spreadsheet like I just showed, I can continue to add more data into my workbook by connecting to content within my organization. So it can be content that I've created that is shared through my organization or through a group, or even connect to Esri's Living Atlas. So maybe I want to add in some congressional districts for context. So I'm going to search for 115th Congress, and I'm going to pull in this data that's been made available by Esri through the online system. Since this is already a spatial layer, it does automatically add it to a map for me. But I don't want it in a separate map. I actually want to drop it behind one of my existing maps. So I'm just going to close that. I'll find my layer that I added in here, and I can just drag that location onto an existing map. So now I have some extra context, and I can change the styling for this layer as well. If I don't really care about showing it by party, I could just show a single location and show those boundaries. I can also synchronize my maps. So as I pan and zoom on one, I can automatically apply that extent change to another map. So as I zoom in on the map on the left, the right one will automatically follow along. So I can always keep the same data or the same extent in view. For either of these maps, I can flip this card over and it'll show me some basic summary statistics about this particular variable. So in our average covered charges, I can see the total count, in the min and max, and I can also enter descriptions if I want to keep this data straight by adding in that little bit of text. I'll flip that card back over. So as we said, we've been looking at data spatially, but we also want to be able to look at it through other types of visualizations. So I'm going to take the same variable for these covered charges, and I'm going to simply drag and drop it onto a chart. Now, since I'm looking at a single numeric data variable, it's going to draw a histogram, so a distribution of that variable. So I can see what kind of the mean and median is. And then if I want to apply chart statistics, I can throw a normal distribution over that to see how this data is distributed. I can also map or chart multiple variables. So for example, maybe I want to compare these average covered charges by the state. So I have the provider state as a field that I can select as well. So I can select multiple different variables and then see what kind of charts I can make from it. So the software is smart enough to kind of filter out chart types that don't apply to these variables. So in this case, I have a category variable and a numeric variable. So I'm just going to make a bar chart from this so I can show the average covered charges by state. By default, it's summing these, but I'm going to go ahead and choose average here on the bottom axis for my chart. So now I see what the average of the averages across each state. And then I can even sort this alphabetically or by my numeric variables. So if I look at descending, I can easily see that California on average is charging the most, and Maryland stands out as charging the least. We can also create tables. So one other kind of version of the data that I might want to look at is looking at the percent that's covered. So I'll choose that variable. along with what we call the hospital referral region. And I'm going to go ahead and make a table from that. So I just selected table up here. We could do that, or we could have dragged and dropped those variables into a table. So you can see this kind of, sums up the percent covered by each referral region. Again, I'm going to change this to an average. And then similarly, as we saw in the chart, we can sort this information, and I can see the referral regions where we're seeing the highest percent covered on average look like they're pretty much in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. If I sort ascending instead, the lowest percentages that are covered tend to be in the South. So we're starting to see some trends, and might lead us to further questions that we want to answer. But just wanted to orient you to what the software looks like and this sort of interactivity between your data variables and the cards that you can create with it. So let me hop back to the slides. Continue on. So now let's take a deeper dive in looking at using insights for analysis. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. One of the key functions that an analyst might need to do is apply selections and filters to their data. So we have attribute filters, spatial filters, and then similar selections. So for attribute filters, these can be applied sort of globally on an entire data set or card. If you just want to narrow it down to a single card, you can do that. Spatial filters can be applied either by dragging and dropping on a polygon area that you're interested in, or using drawing tools to capture those. And we also have selections where we can interactively click on our cards, and if other cards are driven by the same data set, they will highlight and select the corresponding data that they're featuring. And then spatial selections we can do by dragging a selection from one map onto a new map card, and then we'll narrow down the view of the data that we're looking at. And I mentioned the powerful spatial analysis tools that we include. So going beyond just dots on a map, we provide things like spatial aggregation. So if you want to count up features within another feature, we can create buffers or drive times around a feature. Enriching our data. So if there's demographic or lifestyle information that you don't already have in your data set and you want to include that, you can do so by using the enrich data tool. Calculating density, so basically looking at concentrations of your data, and finding nearest. So it's a pretty powerful question to ask. For example, what hospitals are closest to each school? So looking in between two data sets. So those are some of the examples that we've got, spatial analysis tools that we've got available in the product. And we kind of, structure our dialogue to help walk you through the question that you're trying to answer. So if you decide that you want to find, what is the hospital that's closest to each school, we have a dialogue to kind of help guide you to the appropriate tool. And every time that we run an analysis or perform a selection, we create what are called result layers. So these are new temporary layers that live just within your Insights workbook. And so they're created whenever the data takes a new form, like we create a new chart or create a selection, or we run one of those analysis tools. If that new derived data set has value to other people in your organization and you want to make it available to them, you absolutely can. So we can share, those results of your analysis back out as a layer within your organization. Any of the analysis that you perform can also be recorded as a model. So we capture automatically every step that you take through your creation of your different cards. So if you perform, get through creating a bunch of different cards that arrive at a really interesting answer, that model is automatically captured. It can be saved out and shared out to your other analysts in your organization, so that they can then apply new data to those models without having to go back and manually recreate every step that you took. They can just put in their new data set and have it create the corresponding charts and graphs and maps. So this is an example of an analysis view that we're looking at and how we can update the data source with a new data set. So as I've said a few times now, these analysis results are displayed in what we call cards. So we use that term as generically to describe, maps, charts, and tables. They're all considered cards. So we're going to walk through some of the specific types that you can create. So we'll first talk about map cards. So hopefully you're a fan of maps too. So that's why we created them. So these provide interactive mapping of vector data. That means points, lines, and polygons. So right now we do not support what we call raster data or gridded data. So things like aerial imagery is not a layer type that we can really work with. Right now we're just focusing on vector data. And as we saw, the extents between your different maps can be synced. So if you want to always keep the same extent in view, you can do that. And we also have the different base map options. A lot of times we recommend working with these kind of neutral gray backgrounds just because they do let your kind of operational data stand out. But if it is important to have an imagery base map, that's available as well, or things like topography and others. And then when we style our map, we have different styling types. So whether, depending on whether you're working with quantitative or qualitative data, we have the different options. If you've worked with styling data in Esri's platform before, you should be very familiar with these. Just know that when we bring in a layer, like if it's a layer that's already available in your organization, it's a feature service, we will respect the original symbol if you want to use that. Otherwise, you can restyle it. So we can just apply a single symbol to represent the location. If it's qualitative data or categorical data, we use the types, the unique symbol option. And then for numeric data, obviously we have counts and amounts showing size or counts and amounts showing color. And with those, you have your standard classification options like natural breaks, quantile, equal interval, etc. So it should be very familiar to people that have worked within the Esri platform before. So moving on from maps, we're going to talk a little bit more about chart and table types. Now for charts, we have a much wider variety to choose from. I'm not going to talk about every single one. These are some of the more common ones, and we'll see some other examples of ones in the next demo. But bar graphs are a very popular one. You saw me create one of these. So these are ones that we can work with qualitative data. And this allows us to compare information across categories. These bar charts can be horizontal or vertical, and they can be grouped or stacked. So if you want to kind of highlight another variable within your bar chart, you can group your bars by that, and it'll apply different colors for that third variable. And these are useful for identifying broad differences between categories at a glance. However, if you've got a large number of categories, they can quickly become unreadable. So just keep that in mind. You might think about filtering the data, for example, if you want to focus on a few key categories. Tree maps is another really popular one that you'll see a lot of. Again, these are useful with working with qualitative data. And these show kind of hierarchical data. So each category is a proportion of a whole. So their size in the tree map represents their proportion. And so it's easy, again, to compare across these categories by looking at the size, but it's not very effective for revealing small differences between these. It can be kind of hard to estimate which block is bigger than another. Bubble charts are another interesting one that you'll see, again, for working with qualitative data. So this is, again, when we're taking numerical values of variables shown by the size of the circle. So we take a category and then we count up some statistic about it and give it a different size dot. And so the circles can be kind of placed randomly and tightly packed. So it's less perceptually accurate than the bar charts, but does allow for hundreds of values to be visualized in kind of a unique way. We can also work with quantitative data. So if instead of working with a qualitative or categorical variable, if you've got numeric variables, we can combine 3 of those together on a Cartesian coordinate. So x-axis and a y-axis, and then use the size of the bubble to illustrate the third numeric variable. But just be aware that those can become hard to read with too many categories as well. Donut charts, again, another qualitative data chart. These are basically pie charts. It's an easy way to think of it. They just have a hole in the middle. So these are used to show relative proportions or percentages of categories, ideal for between 3 and 8 categories. And so obviously if we're talking about a percentage or proportion, these represent a total. So all the parts that you, or all the categories you include, should constitute the whole. Heat charts, one of the newer charts, is working again with qualitative data. So in this case, we have kind of two categorical variables, and then a frequency shown by a color in a matrix. So in each cell, there's a value associated with those two qualitative variables, and then they're sort of classified on a color ramp, from lower to higher values. And so since this data is classified, if the data range is really wide, you're not going to see a lot of those local variations will be hidden, just based on the nature of the classification. Data clocks is another newer one. So this creates a circular chart of temporal data. So again, working with data, temporal data as a qualitative variable, categorical variable. And so these are commonly used to see the number of events at different periods of time. So you can see in the example below, one of the categorical variables represented by each ring around the circle. And then the date is represented by each kind of wedge of the pie or segment of the clock. And so this again can get hard to read with too many categories. If you have, your pie slices are really tiny, it can get hard to decipher. Histograms, you saw an example of this one that I created. This is working with a quantitative data variable, so numeric variable, and this just shows the distribution, right? So how is this variable distributed? Those values get classified or binned, and then as you saw, we can overlay a normal distribution, so you can compare your variable that you're interested in to a normal distribution. And another option for working with quantitative data, the numeric data, is a scatter plot. So if we want to investigate the relationship between two numeric variables, we can plot those on a scatter plot. So this is asking, are these two variables correlated, and how strongly are they correlated? We can also color code those variables by another, or color code those points by another variable. So if you want to look at categories across that scatter plot, that's an option. We'll see an example of that. You can apply log scale if you want to, kind of help with clarity on visualizing your map. And then we can also fit statistics. So, fit a linear line, for example, to the scatter plot. And, obviously, for statisticians, we should look for a logical reason to expect a relationship. There's a lot of variables out there that might be related or have a correlation, but doesn't actually tell us anything. So hopefully you're looking at something that is meaningful. We also have a line graph or a time series. This is good for temporal data. So visualizing a sequence of values, primarily for looking at trends over time. Good at looking at overall trends and the change from one value or one date to the next. It should only be used with a continuous variable. So again, we'll see an example of a line graph later. So we did, since there are so many different types of charts, and we'll probably continue to add more as time goes on, we have tried to provide some resources to help people kind of wrap their brains around which types of maps or types of charts they should create given the data that they're working with. So this is sort of a poster that was put together. I provided a link at the bottom of the page that actually links to a story map that one of our team members created to help walk people through these different chart types, kind of like what I just went through. And then it provides a link to this poster that you can download at the end of that story map. So feel free to screen capture that, or since this webinar is recorded, you can always reference it back later. So in addition to charts, we also have tables. You saw an example of that. This can work with either, qualitative or quantitative data, and it's good for when, you need to look at exact values, right? So a lot of the charts and maps and things that we've been talking about kind of obscure what those exact numbers are, but if you do need to look at them, obviously you can put them into a table. We can calculate additional statistics on our numeric fields like sum or average. And then, we can sort that information and it can respect selections. So if you make a selection here, we can work with those selections within tables. We also can access the data table. So this isn't really a card, but just while we're talking about tables, this is basically the attribute table for your data set. So if you want to look at the entire data set in tabular format, you can do that by bringing up the data table. And obviously, just like working with it in other parts of the Esri platform, we can sort those fields. We can also add new fields and calculate values right there within that data table. And you can do this on either your source data that you've brought in or the result layers that you create from your analysis. And just to touch on sharing as well, we mentioned a little bit of this, but the workbooks, pages, cards, and workflow templates or analysis models can all be shared in various ways. So you can share those as items within your organization, whether that's online or enterprise. So if you just want to allow other people in your organization to view a workbook that you've put together or a page that you've put together, you can do that. As we mentioned, the result layers, result data sets that you derive can be shared out as feature layers so that they can be used for mapping and analysis and other parts of the platform. And then Insights pages can actually be embedded into applications like story maps. So if you just created a really nice visualization of your data and you want to incorporate it into a public-facing application to share into a story map to kind of augment that story map, you can do that as well. So we provide the little option to get the embed code or the iframe code to put that into your story map. Okay, so now that we've seen some examples of the charts, I'm going to walk through another demo. And I'm going to switch to another workbook that I've kind of already started. So in this case, we're going to be looking at data around terrorism across the globe. We're kind of interested in knowing, where it's happening, how it's happening, the trends, and potentially what's driving it, right? So again, I don't necessarily have a very specific question I'm trying to answer. I'm just starting to look at the data and see what it's telling me and maybe what further analysis I want to do on it. So as we mentioned, this is a workbook that's made up of one or more pages. So you can see I've got a couple other tabs up here that we'll look at in a minute. And then within a page, you can have one or more cards that show, these different types of visualizations. So the first map that I've got started here is just showing the raw data from what is called the Global Terrorism Database. And this is maintained by a group called START at the University of Maryland. And in this case, we're looking at incidents between 2009 and 2015 with at least one fatality. So we've kind of already culled down this data a little bit to narrow our investigation. So I'm looking at a ton of points plotted on the map, but there's not a ton of information that I can glean from this other than overall, high-level trends. And I, maybe want to start changing my visualization a bit to tell me a little bit more. So, for example, I can go in and change my styling from looking at a single location to maybe using a heat map. So this will kind of apply that heat map rendering to my points. And as I zoom in, we'll see how that heat map kind of changes based on the extent that I'm looking at. So that's one way that we can change our visualization to give tell us some more information rather than just those single point locations. I am going to switch back to that single location for the rest of the analysis. All right, so we looked at these high-level patterns and trends. And this map is, an important part of that, but we also want to use these other types of visualizations. So I've already got a couple charts that I've created. Don't worry, we will create some more. So on the bottom left, I've got a bar chart that shows the total fatalities by region. So region is one of the attributes or variables associated with this data set. And on the top right, I have a tree map that shows that same measure, the total number of fatalities, but this time by the organization that's responsible for it. And because these charts and the map are all driven off of this same data set, they become interactive. So if I, for example, click one of these bars in my bar chart, notice how my map is not filtered, but the corresponding points are selected for me on the map or highlighted for me on the map. And same thing with our tree chart, our tree map over here. So any of the organizations that are operating in this region are highlighted for me in that tree map. So for I can click to a different bar and see those changes, those updates on my other cards. So that's a really powerful type of interaction that we can do within Insights. So on here on my bar chart, again, right now I've just got a single variable, the region that I'm showing along with the sum of the fatalities. But as we mentioned, we can group our bar charts. So maybe I want to also look at the type of attack that is typically committed in these areas. I do already have a filter applied on this card, so I'm only interested in 2 types of attacks. There are other types in this data set, but in this case, we're focusing on armed assaults and bombings or explosions. And we can see in a lot of these regions, the numbers are pretty close, but we can see a couple areas where that stands out. In the Middle East and North Africa, we can see the bombings and explosions far outnumber the armed assaults. And then the reverse is true in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are far more armed assaults rather than bombings. So that, again, this starts to show us interesting things in the data that we might not have been able to see just by looking at it in a table. I'm going to take the another variable that we've got over here, which is the target type. So what institutions or people were these organizations targeting in their attacks? And I can drag that, right from my data set over here, maybe into a table. So I can get that, count feature, again, sort it if I want, to show that, in most of these attacks, private citizens and property were the targets. If I decide that, hey, I didn't actually want to look at this in a table, I really want to put it into a chart, I can do that right here from the card. So I can change the visualization type from a table to maybe something like a bubble chart. So that's one we haven't looked at yet. So here's that bubble chart look, and so we can see, again, the size of the dot representing the kind of relative proportion of that category of that variable. So another aspect of this that we might want to look at is the time element. So notice in my data set over here, I do have a date field. So I can break it down into different components, but I can look at the overall date field. And then I also want to look at the number of fatalities by or over time. So I'm gonna choose that variable as well as the date. And again, I can drag these over, or I can choose from the chart drop down here. And because of the fact that I've chosen a date field, it's kind of guiding me towards using this time series chart. So I'll add that in. Let me make it a little bit bigger here. And so we can see the date here along the bottom. And in this case, it took the average of our fatalities field. I'm going to look at the sum. So I want to look at the total over time instead of the average. You can see overall, there's definitely an upward trend in the number of fatalities in the more recent years. We can also, again, since these are interactive, again, all driven off the same data set, if I say, well, I'm really interested in when these organizations have been operating. So for example, if I click Boko Haram from my tree map, again, all my other cards are going to filter to show their respective data. And we can see on our time series when these organizations have been active, really since the end of 2010. And if I change and look at if I select a different organization in the tree map, for example, ISIL, then I can see that they've been operating more recently. So it wasn't until 2013 that they started their attacks. And of course, these can also be grouped. So if I wanted to, group this by organization or attack type, I could do that. It will probably get unreadable if I choose organization because there are so many of them. On our tree map, I mentioned that I have a filter already on my bar chart down here. I also have a filter applied to this tree map. So just if I open that to take a look at it, I've kind of limited the data reflected in this chart to be where the total number of fatalities is greater than 100. So it helps to narrow down the data and only focus on those attacks where or organizations where they've unfortunately killed a lot of people. I can remove that. So if I turn that off, we'll see how that changes my tree map, and we see how it quickly starts to get unreadable down here in the bottom right with so many organizations. But the good thing is Insights is aware of the changes that you've made. So if I decide, oh, right, I didn't want to remove that filter, I really want to put it back on, rather than having to go back and reconstruct it, I can hit the undo button up here in the top left, and that'll reapply that filter to me. So again, right now, this filter is only being applied to this card. I could filter it to look at, globally here if I filter the data set itself over on the left-hand side. But in this case, I just wanted to apply it to this card. So I'm going to look at one other chart type. I'm going to look at the organization and the target type, so who they were targeting. And so these are two category variables. So if you notice over here, the little symbols next to each variable kind of tells you what type of variable it is that we're working with, whether it's date field, numeric field, category field, and our location field. So I've got two category fields. So these are the types of charts that I can make from those. And maybe I'm interested in the relationship between these two variables. So one of the ones, since I'm working with category or qualitative data, I can create what's called a chord diagram. So I'm going to create that, and you can see it is extremely unreadable right now. So it's the same problem that as I mentioned above with the tree map. There's just so many organizations that are captured in this database. It's probably a good idea to filter it down. So I'm going to create a filter on this card on the organization field. First, I'm going to filter out any of the unknowns. That's not really meaningful. So that filtered out a little bit. So let's keep going here. I'm also going to filter out unknown target types. And again, doesn't make a huge amount of change. So we need to do something a little bit more drastic. And I'm going to apply the same type of filter that we have on that tree map where the number of fatalities, I'm only going to focus on, where there's been greater numbers of that. So I'll narrow down our view even more. So now we get a much more readable chord diagram. And so this kind of shows us the relationship of these two variables. So in this case, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the terrorist organizations, and on the right-hand side, we're looking at the targets that they've targeted in their attacks. We can kind of see by the width of this swath here on these different types, which ones what they're targeting the most. So we can see that Boko Haram has been targeting mostly private citizens and property, but also the military, as well as religious figures and institutions. And again, just like all the other data sets that we've looked at, if I click in here, it's going to filter my other cards to show just the corresponding data. So we could look and see if there are any trends about when they were targeting these various types of organizations or people. Does our time series, chart reflect any changes, or is it seemingly random? So again, these are different types of questions that these various analyses and visualizations can lead you to. All right, so I'm going to go to our next tab. So this is another page within my workbook. And in this case, we've looked at the incidents and the attacks that have happened across the globe. But I want to leverage some other data from another organization that's called the Institute for Economics and Peace. And they create what's called a composite index. They create a global terrorism index, which is a composite index of terror by country that uses multiple factors, including fatalities, injuries, incidents, and property damage. So again, I've got an Excel file with their data. So their data is by country, by year, with the index, their kind of overall index, as well as some other measures that they calculate. So I'm going to add this data set in, again, just from my Excel workbook. And just like we saw with the hospital data earlier, again, we don't assume that this is spatial, but since we have country information, we can enable location on this data. So in this case, I don't have coordinates. I'm going to use geography. I'm going to map this data to a geography boundary. So in this case, I'll use that country field from my GTI data set. And then if you noticed, I've got a countries layer already added in here. So I'm going to match that to my country boundaries. That was just data that I grabbed from the Living Atlas. And then I can go ahead and run that, and then we'll be able to map any of these GTI variables spatially. So give that a second to finish. There we go. So now I've got my location field. So if I just wanted to plot the countries, I could drag that field over, but I'm interested in looking at, for example, the GTI itself, the index that's calculated. So if I go ahead and put that on a map, we'll see, again, counts and amount size. So the larger the size, the higher the index, right? So that's another way that you can geo-enable your data, is by mapping it to different boundaries. And again, similar to the hospitals we looked at before, if I want to get some summary statistics on this particular variable, I can. So this has a sum, min, max, mean, etc. All right, so one of the measures that they come up with that factors into this index is what they call group grievances. And this is a measure that takes into account ethnic and religious tension in the country. So I want to see if there's any relationship between this global terrorism index and group grievances. Notice that these are both numeric variables, so quantitative variables. So if I drag them over to put them on a chart, the only chart that I can use two numeric variables with is the scatter plot. So this is that example, the type of chart where we're kind of trying to examine the correlation between two variables. And right now it's plotted the GTI on this axis, the vertical axis, and the group grievance on the horizontal axis. I can switch those. So if I want to have group grievances be vertical, I can do that. Now, first thing I notice is there's a distinct line here at the bottom, or there's a lot of countries or a lot of measures where they've had 0 as the group grievance calculation. So I'm going to go ahead and filter those out. So let's kind of clean up my chart a little bit here. So I'll choose that field, and we'll just slide this up to 1 and apply. All right, so at least it takes that little bit out of the chart. And so next thing I want to do is, I'm looking at this and I might say, well, it kind of looks like there's a correlation there. So maybe I want to fit a line to it. I want to see if, actual statistics wise, is there any real relationship? So notice we can fit a linear line, exponential, or polynomial. So depending on the type of relationship that these variables have. So I'll just choose linear because that's probably the best I can do here. And let me get that map back down a bit. Give us a little bit more room to look at the chart. This will, fit a line and report an R² value, which kind of tells you the strength of the relationship. And right now it's at 0.367, so kind of correlated, but not very tightly. So one of the other things that we mentioned we can do with this is color code the points within our scatter plot by one of our other qualitative variables or categorical variables. So one of the other ones that they track in this data set is the OECD status, which is the Organization of Economically Developed Countries. And that's an organization that exists to promote trade and economic growth and development. So we'll see which of these points, which of these countries fall within that category. So we can see color coded, and I can do this on the map as well. So maybe I want to change the styling here to look at that status, and we'll see the red and blue here. Red is member; those are the the countries that are members of that organization, and blue is non-OECD countries. So again, maybe I'm seeing looks like might be a tighter relationship between the blue points and not so much the red points. So again, I can further filter my scatter plot. Maybe I'll filter out any of those countries that are members of that organization. So I only want the non-members. Apply that, and now I get an update to my card just showing those blue points. And if I look at that R squared value, it has gone up to 0.475. So I am getting a stronger relationship, stronger correlation between these variables. We're getting some noise on the line. If you guys wouldn't mind muting yourself, that'd be great. Thanks. All right, so that's looking at the scatter plot. So again, this might lead to more questions. Maybe some of these other variables are ones that I want to examine in a similar way to see their correlation to this GTI, this index overall. So I'm going to move on to my third tab. This is where we're going to focus on a single country. So we're just going to look at Afghanistan. So I've added in that same incident database. So the first data set that we're looking at on the first tab, but it has been filtered to just show the points for Afghanistan. So since that country is a variable here, I can just do an attribute filter. And so I've applied that here at the data set level because I want every card within this page to kind of respect that filter, since that this is the only country we're concerned about in this case study. So next thing I want to do is maybe look at the kind of local administrative boundaries and see what the distribution is of these points across those boundaries. So I'm going to add in some more data from my organization. So in this case, I'm going to look in my own content where I've uploaded a shapefile for the kind of district boundaries within Afghanistan. Go ahead and add that into another card. And this is again, the kind of default symbol, the original symbol that this layer has within my organization. But if I do want to change it, I can come in here and use just a single location. If I want to change the color, I can do that. So now I've got my district boundaries. And again, I can synchronize my maps, make sure that they're always in the same view. And what I really want to do is sum up the number of, either the number of incidents or the number of fatalities from these attacks within each of these district boundaries. So I can actually take the data set from one card and drag it onto another card. And I can either just drop it on top of these districts as a new layer. But in this case, I want to use spatial aggregation. So this is one of the analysis tools that's available. So I'm going to kind of drop it into that quadrant. It brings up the spatial aggregation tool. Another way to get to that tool is simply to use the analysis button, and this will take me back to those same tools. You can see the other ones that we mentioned in the slides about creating buffers and enriching data, for example. But you can always do this drag and drop to do the spatial aggregation, and notice the other option there is to filter by selected feature. So if I narrowed down one of my districts and I dragged that district over onto my map with the points, I could filter the points just to show what's in that district, for example. But I'm going to do the spatial aggregation. It's already selected the appropriate inputs here where I've got my districts as the area layer. My global terrorism database data is what I'm summarizing. So I can do the count, just the pure number of incidents, and then I can add other statistics here. So if I want to add the total number of fatalities, I can do that. I'll go ahead and run that. And so notice as it's running, I'll point out here, I went pretty quickly there, but this is my result data set. So if you've noticed, the source data sets are these the black symbols, and then any results, any result data that you get from creating a new chart or performing an analysis like this, all done with these orange symbols. So now I can change the styling on this to show, to highlight, that count or the total number of fatalities by district. And then if I want to use, colors instead of shapes or sizes, I can do that. And then, change my classification type, for example, and I can see the distribution across those districts. So again, this might help narrow down further focus of this case study that we're performing if we only want to focus on a subregion within that country. So we mentioned the sharing. All of the analysis that I've done is being captured in this analysis view. So it's just a little button that you can toggle on here. So for any of these pages, I can look at the analysis view. As we said, these can be shared out as models. So I can save this to my organization, allow other analysts to bring it into their insights workbooks and update the data set if they've got another section of years that they want to look at rather than the few that I'm focusing on. And then the pages themselves, we can look at the page and print it, share the page. This is where we can share it if we want to put it into a group. We want to allow other people in our organization to view that page. We can do that, and we can also share entire workbooks with other insights users within our organization. So let me just wrap up real quick with a few last slides on how to get insights. So we can access insights in ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise that you run on your own infrastructure. So it's available in both type parts of the platform. Once you have Insights licenses, your administrator has to assign that license to you. So it is an extra license. And then we can, provide some information here on licensing. For online, there's a yearly term license with some credits that you get with that. For enterprise, it's term or perpetual. But if you're an enterprise user, please see your account manager for details. You may already have access to it, but they're your best resource for getting information about what you have access to under your EA. But I also want to point out the 21-day free trial. So if you want to give it a try before committing, then you can try it out here. I'll open this link real quick. So this takes you to the free trial page. We also have, this can link to our overview of the product itself if you just want to read more about it. And so then I think I'm going to turn it over to Lauren here in the last few minutes just to wrap up with some final thoughts.
Thanks, Bonnie. For our viewers, you can learn more and sign up for an Insights trial license here on the last page, the Insights for ArcGIS webpage. There's a free 21-day trial, and there are additional resources stemming from that webpage. And then we also have a webinar website where you can view past recordings, and then our future webinars will be added shortly, so you can check back and register for our next webinar, which will take place on August 15th. The webinar will focus on how to leverage Esri's community analysts for policy analysis. And we will have other webinars quarterly from there. So thank you very much and have a great day.